Welcome to the Salt Lake City Planning Commission. Today's date is Wednesday, August 28th, 2024. The Planning Commission consists of residents from each Salt Lake City district that are appointed in a manner providing balanced geographic, professional, neighborhood, and community interest representation. The Planning Commission reviews and acts on any changes to the city's general plans, small area plans, special studies, zoning ordinances, and zoning district maps. The Commission also reviews and acts on planned unit developments, conditional uses, and certain subdivisions. Our goal is to provide a welcoming and safe environment for everyone. We ask that those in attendance adhere to a few ground rules. 1, silence or turn off your cell phones. 2, respect the person speaking and do not interrupt or do other things that could intimidate or deter others from exercising their right to be heard. Clapping, cheering, jeering, shouting, or other actions used to discourage people who have different opinions from participating will not be tolerated. People who attempt to diminish someone else's input may be removed from the room. 3, if you wish to speak, come to the microphone once the public hearing has been opened and state your name. Members of the public will have 2 minutes to comment. Your time cannot be combined with someone else's time. Everyone will get the same amount of time to speak so that we can ensure everyone is treated equally. If you are a representative of an officially registered recognized organization and the item you wish to speak on is within the boundaries of your organization, you will be given 5 minutes. If it is outside of your boundaries, you will be given 2 minutes. 4, if you have a handout you want the commission to see, you need to leave copies because they become part of the legal record. 5, when commenting, speak clearly, keep your comments on topic and brief. 6, questions asked during a public hearing will not be answered during the public hearing. Rather, the commission may ask the applicant or staff to answer questions after the public hearing is closed, or ask city staff to follow up with you at a later time. Our first item is approval of the minutes from July 31st and also from August 14th.
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
I have a discussion point to that motion. I believe that Commissioner Scheer spoke during the open forum, and if not then, spoke at some point during the meeting last time that we convened that is not reflected in the minutes. I know it was near the beginning of the meeting, and it was after Attorney Pasker had spoken.
I had asked her a question, and she answered it.
Okay.
It was about the scope of development agreements and whether or not they come before the Planning Commission.
Would you like to make a friendly amendment to the motion to approve to include that on the August 14th?
I just don't think I remember well enough exactly what was said to include an amendment.
I would just say, if you don't mind, Commissioner Scheer, in the open forum, Commissioner Scheer asked Attorney Pasker to elaborate on whether or not development agreements come before the Planning Commission. That's enough.
Okay.
I remember that too. I think it was during the report of the director. That's when, is that right? The minutes for 8/14, that's when it's noted that Attorney Catherine Pasker discussed development agreements during that section of the meeting. And then I feel like your question was after that. I don't remember either, exactly. Maybe somebody could just
meeting should be reviewed so that the minutes
review
are
the video.
corrected.
Okay, can I amend my motion to approve the minutes for 7:31 and for request that that specific item is reviewed for the 8:14 minutes? So that's my motion is to approve the 7:31 minutes.
I can second.
Okay, we have a motion to approve the July 31st minutes by Commissioner Burrows and a second from Commissioner Gale. Any discussion to the motion? Well, let's take a vote then. Commissioner Gale,
Yes.
Commissioner Barry,
Yes.
Commissioner Scott.
I'm staying because I wasn't here for the
Gotcha.
7:31.
Commissioner Shear,
Yes.
Commissioner Kratzik,
Yes.
Commissioner Burrows.
Yes.
And the chair also votes yes. That passes with 6 yeas and 1 abstention. And if we don't vote on meeting minutes, for one of the meeting minutes, does that automatically give us an opportunity to have that reviewed and further amended?
So if you don't want to vote on something because you want something looked at, then I would just table it to the next meeting
Okay.
with that instruction to staff.
Got it. Then we'll need a motion to table approving the August 14th minutes to the next meeting.
I move to table the August 14th minutes.
A
Do we
friendly amendment to that motion with instruction to staff to review the recording of that meeting and amend the minutes accordingly.
Okay. Do we have a second?
Second.
Okay, we have a motion from Commissioner Shear, an amended motion from Commissioner Gale, and a second from Commissioner Kratzik. Any discussion to the motion? Let's take a vote on tabling that. Commissioner Scott,
Yes.
Commissioner Shear,
Yes.
Commissioner Kratzik,
Yes.
Commissioner Barry,
No.
Commissioner Gale,
Yes.
Commissioner Burrows,
Yes.
and the chair also votes yes. That passes, the motion to table passes 6-1. And we will move on to the report of the chair and vice chair. The chair has nothing to report.
Vice Chair has nothing to report.
We will move to the report of the director.
Thank you. I just want to update the commission on some actions that the city council took last night. You may recall several months ago, there was a request to vacate a portion of 700 South. This is way out next to 5600 West, where public utilities recommended and the planning staff recommended not vacating it. The planning commission recommended that vacating it provided public utilities had maintained all existing rights to maintain infrastructure. The city council decided not to vacate 700 South at their meeting last night. They also adopted the text amendment related to projecting signs in those business districts where they weren't currently allowed. So that passed. They also passed a text amendment that would have allowed single-family attached dwellings in certain commercial zones. So that'll be reflected in the zoning consolidation as well to make sure that we're not losing that. And I believe the consolidation already addresses that. But and then finally, they also adopted the zoning changes related to the sports, entertainment, culture, and convention district. And during the briefing on that, they did indicate that they wanted, and this probably may relate back to your last meeting's discussion on this, and I wasn't at that meeting, so I'm not sure, but there will be a development agreement associated with that, which would include adding specific design guidelines and standards for whatever ends up being redeveloped as associated with that. That development agreement will come to the Planning Commission for a recommendation before the City Council acts on it. So I wanted to update you on that as well. So you'll see that. We don't know when, but at some point in the future. And that's all I had. Thanks.
Thank you.
I have a question. Under what standards is that development agreement to be reviewed?
So it's not really subject to specific standards like a zoning text amendment would be. Some of that will be, I think, outlined in based on what the participation agreement that the city and SEG have agreed to, and ultimately will be approved by the City Council and make sure it complies with all of those goals and everything else. So,
Thank you.
We will move to our open forum. If any commissioners have anything that they want to discuss. Seeing nothing, let's go ahead and move to our regular agenda. Our one and only item on the regular agenda is text amendment to Chapter 21A.59, Design Review. Case number PLN PCM 2024-00294. And our planner is Amanda Roman.
Hello. Yeah, this will be a short agenda for you guys. Okay. So, this is a text amendment that has come before you
Amanda,
twice.
your screen's not up.
Oh, it's not. There you go. Thank you. All right. This is a text amendment that has come before you twice for briefings, and today's the public hearing. So on November 8th of last year, 2023, the commission requested amendments to our design review chapter in Chapter 21A 59, specifically requested to remove a standard relating to massing in Section D. This standard had required larger buildings to use vertical and horizontal modulation to align with the scale of surrounding structures, and this was intended to reduce the visual impact of the building. The standard's on the screen now. The commission found that the standard often resulted in overly complex designs without being consistent in the end result. And then the commission also included a provision that allowed staff to review the rest of the design review chapter, which we did. So the purpose and goals of the amendment, the purpose is to amend the language for clarity, ensure the language meets the intent of each standard, and delete standards that are addressed elsewhere in the zoning ordinance. Goals of the amendment are to reduce subjectivity, establish a consistent review framework for staff, and provide clear expectations to applicants. And then planning staff also added new standards to better support the purpose of the design review process. The design review process, the purpose states, the intent of the process is to review larger developments to verify new developments are compatible with their surroundings, impacts to public infrastructure and public spaces are addressed, and that new development helps achieve development goals outlined in the adopted master plans of the city as identified in the purpose statement of each zoning district. So the scope of the design review process, modifications to Chapter 21A 37 design standard, modifications to those base standards of each zoning district are required to go through the design review process. All projects requesting additional building height or reduced building height in some zones must go through the design review process. Some zones have square footage requirements for buildings. If those are exceeded, the building needs to go through the design review process. And then finally, projects that receive less than 125 points in the transit station area zoning districts are required to go through the design review process. The TSA zone is proposed to be deleted as part of the zoning consolidation, so we'll need to make modifications to this to remove that requirement if that zoning modification or zoning amendment goes through. So the applicability, the standards listed below have been determined to be applicable to all projects that are undergoing design review, regardless of the requested modifications. Standard E is only relevant for buildings that exceed the maximum street-facing facade length under 21A 37, and then standard G only applies to buildings requesting additional height as allowed in the zoning district. Applicants are going to be required to address each subsection and its standards. We changed the format of the sentences to say and or to clarify that each standard will be applicable. If it's not applicable based on a certain property or certain situation, then it still needs to be addressed and explained why it's not applicable. And then these standards are intended to guide rather than prescribe exact requirements. And then we also added a exception, so under the applicability of this chapter, that proposals meeting design standards in chapter 21A 37 that align with the design review standard will be deemed compliant. So for instance, if a building meets the ground floor use, glass, building entrances, and blank wall requirements in chapter 37, so like just the base zoning requirements, then it would be reasonable to assume that it meets the pedestrian interest standards under design review, because those speak to ground floor activation, transparency. So that was added. And then proposed modifications. I'm going to go through the 4 sections with the most modifications. So standard C is pedestrian interest, the one I just referred to. This section will have minor changes for clarity and to address the overall intent of this section, which is an increased ground floor pedestrian interest and street activation. So the standards are essentially the same, with the addition of requiring buildings on corner lots to provide a corner entrance that's publicly accessible, transparent, and unobstructed. That requirement was originally going to be proposed in the street-facing facade length section, but we relocate it here so that it applies to any corner building, not just those exceeding the maximum street-facing facade length. So that language ensures the entrance is usable, not blocked by interior display cases, storage, or signage. That would defeat the purpose of having an entrance at that location. Standard D is building massing. This is the section where the petition was initiated to delete the standard on the screen relating to building modulation. The intent of this standard is to reduce the visual massing of buildings and relate them to the human scale. The massing and scales of structures should be proportionate and compatible with existing structures in the vicinity. So moving forward, staff is proposing that every building going through the design review process must address the standards under Section D, regardless of their overall requested modifications. So we're proposing to delete the standard as requested by the commission, and then this building massing section will have 3 overall standards. So standard 1 requires buildings to relate to the scale and the context of the site, which was an existing standard. We just modified a little bit of the language for clarity. Standard 2 on the screen requires buildings to have buildings taller than 3 stories need to include a distinct base. There are more prescriptive requirements that have been added to this standard. So buildings taller than 50 feet would be required to have a 20-foot base, and then buildings over 100 feet in height would need to provide a 3-story base or be consistent with the existing street wall. And then the other standard, which is an existing standard, requires buildings to provide secondary architectural elements. The third standard that we are proposing for the building massing section is speaking to window placement, fenestration patterns. So the overall purpose of the standard is to add depth and dimensionality to large building facades, which can be very flat. The standard states that the windows need to reflect the scale and the like solid and void ratio of the established character of the neighborhood, or that which is described in the general plan. Windows shall consist of human scale proportions with consistent spacing and alignment. I provided the photos of 2 buildings on the side, which would meet this standard. And then the other section would be that unless a building is clad in all glass, window openings shall be recessed by a minimum of 3 inches to help add this depth to the building. So the 3-inch window reveal was initially adopted for new construction in local historic districts. That's where the standard was pulled from. It adds aesthetic value by creating shadow lines, and also has some functional purposes as well. However, staff does recognize that this could increase construction costs, potentially raising the purchase or rental rates of new buildings. So since affordable housing is a priority, we speak to it all the time, and we're passing a lot of amendments to support our efforts. We do want just to acknowledge this up front, so it can be considered with the recommendation. And then also, as I specified in the staff report, this standard wouldn't be able to be met if buildings are clad in all glass, which you see downtown, just based on the type of construction. So, and then the final thought on this one is, if this requirement is not feasible due to construction costs or it's not supported, planning staff just recommends the Planning Commission consider whether the rest of the design review standards can effectively address the issue of large flat building facades if this is overly prescriptive. The overall aim is to balance high quality design with affordability. Standard E relates to the additional street-facing building length. This requirement, this section is only required for buildings requesting additional building length as allowed in the underlying zoning district. So the original proposal put a maximum building length of 250 feet. The final version, we have changed it to 25% increase. We changed it to a 25% increase because the new mixed-use zones have some shorter building lengths that will be proposed. Our lower intensity mixed-use zones, MU2 and MU3, are proposed to have maximum building lengths of 110 feet. So as it was written, those could have more than doubled, which really defeats the purpose. So we changed it to 25% increase, which still puts a maximum of 250 feet for buildings that can be 200 feet in the underlying zoning district. And that's most of our commercial zoning districts, and then the proposed MU5 through 11 districts as well. So additional building length is one of the most requested modifications that we see come through with the design review, and has arguably one of the biggest impacts on our streetscape and pedestrian experience. Unlimited building length has resulted in long, short structures with more parking, less transparency, and reduced street level activation, which is why we're proposing putting a maximum building length. This would still allow buildings in many of our commercial or mixed-use zones to cover 1/3 of the block face, 660-foot block face, so they would still be incredibly long. The overall standards just intend to break up long facades and making them buildings seem smaller by using proportional massing, visual interest, transparency, and supporting ground level activity. So,
I'm sorry, would you say that again? It says that it would allow them to be a block long?
no, so even as proposed with the maximum building length,
Uh-huh.
they would still be 1/3 of a block face long at 250 feet, since our block faces are 660 feet. So
Okay.
even
sorry. Okay.
even putting a maximum, they're quite long. Tied to the building length, staff is proposing eliminating, making it so that projects that receive additional building length are no longer eligible to reduce the ground floor activation of the base zoning district. So if the building's longer, it cannot be longer to provide for more parking. It would need to be an activated streetscape. And then a new standard since the briefings, just talking about different building forms, building uses, and unfortunately, the design review process can't reasonably provide standards for every situation. So we're recommending exempting specific uses from this requirement. So we have a list of the uses and some examples, and these kind of uses, convention centers, schools, performing arts centers, they require flexibility in their design to fulfill their specific functions effectively. And so we're proposing to exempt those uses from this standard. They would still need to provide the visual interest and meet the visual interest standard, just not the building length and ground floor activation. And then additional building height. This section had a lot of modifications. We mostly deleted from the additional building height section. Some of the standards are covered elsewhere. So for example, building step backs are already regulated. We had a lot of building step back standards. They were confusing. And so with the proposed zoning consolidation that will be coming forward, that has been modified, refined, just to make it easier to administer. We're proposing deleting the cornices and roofline standard, as we've talked about before and shown examples of, is very prescriptive. It was hard to administer, and it really didn't result in the type of development that it was intended to. The section originally had a building modulation standard. We're proposing to delete that since it reflects the building modification standard, or building modulation standard that was originally requested to be deleted. So that standard had required buildings to step up and down to its neighbors, which planning staff, when we were reviewing it, it might limit development potential, which we did not want to do with this amendment. And then we're also proposing to delete the shadow study requirement, just given the involving impacts of climate change. Shaded outdoor spaces may be seen as more beneficial than a negative impact of height. So proposed modifications for the additional building height, the potential wind and snow impacts will still need to be addressed. Those are existing standards. New standards include screening all rooftop mechanical equipment, and then buildings abutting a landmark site need to feature a horizontal design element on the street-facing facade that aligns with a corresponding element on the historic structure. And I provided some examples below. Other just general modifications, as a part of the design review application, a streetscape study needs to be submitted, just demonstrating how the building fits in with the overall block face. If the building is on a corner, then the applicant will need to provide a study of both block faces. We added a option under the open space requirements. Right now, an applicant can pick 3 of 6. We're proposing to add a children's amenity space as one of those options for to activate open spaces. Modified the screening standards just to meet this the same language in the design standards, and then also, as mentioned before, proposing to delete standards that are regulated elsewhere in the zoning ordinance. So, planning staff is recommending that the Planning Commission forward a positive recommendation to the City Council to adopt the proposed amendments to the design review chapter in 21A 59. And I am available for questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from the commission?
Yeah, on the corner entrance one that you were talking about, is it that a corner entrance is required, or if like they do have the whole block, does it mean that every corner has to have an entrance? So if a building is under that 200 feet, but is one of the smaller blocks that's broken up, would it require corner entrances on like?
So if it had If it's like on
If
two
it had
different
like
corners?
if it had, if it was facing 3 streets.
Oh, it was intended to really address the longer buildings, not necessarily ones with multiple frontages. So I can look at that if we wanted to only require one corner entrance and make them, if that was suggested prior to moving forward to the city council.
Okay, I was just wondering.
Yeah, it wasn't necessarily, now thinking it through, like you said, necessarily intended to have a corner entrance for every street-facing facade, which sometimes happens. But originally, the standard was just intended to break up the long facades for buildings that are over 200 feet.
Okay,
So
thanks.
that could be reworked if it was added as like a condition.
Yeah, I have a question about the corner entrance too.
Mhm.
Are you saying that, are you anticipating that this is a corner entrance like it's kitty corner to the corner? I mean, it's, it actually is not perpendicular to either side, or is it any entrance that's within a certain feet of the corner?
It was intended to be actually at the corner, not offset. And it was, the intent was to have like an ascension.
So a triangular space there, is what you're saying. I can imagine many, many designs where that would not be a very good thing. I mean, where that would be very difficult to do. And I don't know about the whole corner entrance thing is kind of problematic in terms of how a building circulation is sometimes put together too. I mean, if it's stores, okay, but if that's the entrance to an apartment building, that's gonna make a sort of hall, if you have to go in and go through a hallway, the hallway's gonna be angular to the orientation of the whole angular thing kind of is a problem.
Mhm.
So I think it's a problem design-wise because it's very specific.
Okay.
And I think we would all start getting this sort of look all over Salt Lake where it's kind of the same look. And I'm just kind of not sure that that's our intention. I think the intention is to activate a corner,
That is the intention.
but having something that's kitty corner to the corner or a diagonal to the corner maybe isn't necessarily, maybe it's, a little square entrance or even a little round entrance or all kinds of little things that it could happen. So I don't think we specified that, but we also don't specify it. So I'm kind of a little bit worried about the language.
Okay.
I'd like to be able to have an entrance, that
Near the corner?
near the corner, something so that we don't have, or within 5 feet of a corner. Well, I don't know. What do you think, Brian?
I was just gonna say like within a quarter, like 25% of the facade length. That way, it kind of gives you a little bit more
Flexibility.
flexibility.
Yeah.
If the building's a lot larger, you can push it in a little bit more. If it's smaller, it would keep it out.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm always wanting to have a good entrance. I mean, some very identifiable entrance. That's the one thing that I would say in design review is very important. Sometimes buildings just have this sort of nothing entrance.
Mhm.
There's nothing to it. There's no definition.
Right.
And so that's just something that's just definitely identifiable as the entrance. And on a corner property, sure, it could be, I don't know. And I should have brought this up before. I know. I'm sorry. Does anybody else have anything to say about this, or am I the only one?
No, I understand. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. The intent is to activate the corner and provide something viable
Identifiable entrance.
and to break up those long expanses. That's the intent of it.
Break up the, what expanses? The length?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry. Hi.
Join So I believe you're referring to C4. So C is building facade shall facilitate pedestrian interest and interaction by including, and then 4 is buildings located on corner lots shall incorporate architectural features that emphasize the building's corner, including a prominent building entrance that is publicly accessible, transparent, and unobstructed.
Okay.
Is that right? Okay.
So it doesn't actually say it has to be,
It doesn't, it's pretty loose
It
as
is,
far as
yeah.
like, you know, an architect could be relatively
no,
creative.
I think actually that's good language. Now I'm a little concerned about the whole issue of a building circulation on the ground floor for to get to an elevator, to get to a mailroom, to get to a blah, blah, blah. The corner might not be
It might not.
the most effective. Of course, there can always be another entrance. It's not as prominent.
Yeah, and I don't think that the intent is to not dictate a triangular entrance.
Right.
It's to create some sort of prominent emphasis of that corner so that the corner doesn't just disappear in the building. That's what we were trying to address.
And just kind of thinking about like some of the kind of shops and bodegas in like Brooklyn, a lot of the kind of corner entrances there are not necessarily meant to become circulation of the whole building. There can be like, it's a place where people are kind of meeting at the corner to get in for some reason. So I don't know that I'm particularly concerned about building circulation so.
Thank you.
I have a question about the section about building massing. It said the scale and solid to void ratio should match that is in the current context or is what's outlined as desired in the general plan.
Mm-hmm.
Do our general plans, are they specific as to void and solid ratios for this neighborhood? Or like, does the East Bench have a solid to void ratio outlined as desired in the general plan?
So that part is existing language just to cover potential updates to general plans. Our general plans do speak to, some of them do speak to specific design guidelines that they'd like to, like for example, the Sugar House general plan.
What does it say? What does it say that would guide the design of how the windows are outlined?
So I'm just giving an example. That plan does speak to specific design elements that are desired, like for example in their business district. And so this was covering the general language is just covering if it is spoken to in the plan, then that needs to be reflected. But
What do you know? Do you have an example of what one of our general plans say that would give guidance as to what the windows should be like?
I don't.
Because on that page there were a couple of pictures of buildings that look different to me, but also similar, and I wonder how the context of the neighborhood or the general plan was reflected in like the window or the massing of those two buildings.
Yeah, I think just to build off of Amanda's point to the general plan, we do have a lot of context within plans of East Bench, for example. It does break down existing residential neighborhoods as well as existing commercial neighborhoods, or not neighborhoods, but maybe nodes.
Yeah.
And the elements that those areas are consistent of. And so maybe if a building was being redeveloped that was considered out of character, that existing area, we could utilize that general plan to see what was identified as being important or characteristic of that area. So I think like specifically the East Bench really goes into significant detail as far as features in the residential areas. I'm not sure about the commercial, but it just allows us to use additional information that we have at our fingertips to apply for design review. So
Okay.
Yep.
And then the streetscape study, is that a kind of intense new thing that we're asking for? Or is it simple?
This is that's one of the requirements for new construction, is to provide a streetscape analysis. Essentially, the applicant puts in rendering showing how the building fits in with the scale of the block face.
This is new construction in a local historic district or associated with a landmark site. So it's what the Historic Landmark Commission evaluates when determining compatibility for that new.
So we have a definition for that? We have some kind of standard for that? Would people know when you say a street analysis, they know what that is?
I believe that was added to the application materials as part of this draft.
Yeah, it says the streetscape study that illustrates how the building integrates with the block face. The study shall include the building height, height of the ground floor or building base, street-facing facade length, front yard setback, and location of vehicular entrances of existing buildings. If the proposed building is located on a corner lot, the analysis shall incorporate both block faces.
And this is not currently required with all design review applications, but it will be.
Correct.
It's currently required for other applications, for new construction and stuff like
Yes,
that.
this was an idea pulled from new construction in local historic districts.
Okay, and it's not, is it real expensive? Does it take a long time? You just ask your architect or designer throughout
Yeah.
this rendering and,
I mean, depending on the applicant, we already sometimes get a version of this, looking at building massing, building heights. You know, if applicants are requesting additional building heights, they'll provide like a rendering of surrounding building heights. So I wouldn't say it would be a huge ask.
I feel like we have seen them with a lot of applications, but maybe not every design review, but it will be. Okay.
Well, let's open up the public hearing on this. Would anyone like to give comment on this? Have we received any emails? We will close the public hearing and bring it back to the commission.
Okay, I have a couple of things.
Okay.
So if you go to C2, and this is just an example. So throughout the ordinance, there are some lists that are numbered lists that are separated at the end of the numbers by semicolons, but in the middle of those semicolon phrases, you'll have periods. And I think that potentially creates some ambiguity for you because the period indicates the end of a list, and then you have the semicolon that's indicating a continuing list. So I would just maybe look at that and maybe have the attorneys look at that and see how you want to structure that so that you're not creating any ambiguity with that. And then let's look at on D3, it says include secondary architectural elements such as balconies, porches, vertical bays, belt courses, fenestrations, and window reveals. And I just wondered if that was intentionally an and or if that might be an or.
We can change it to an or.
I mean, just because and is inclusive, right? So, I
Doesn't the such as modify
such
that?
as balconies, porches, vertical bays,
That
belt
doesn't-
courses,
That doesn't suggest
fenestrations,
you have to do
and
them all.
is suggesting and, is
Okay, well,
suggesting
we
all
can
of them,
Or.
right?
I can change it to an or. Yeah, I thought
I'm just
the
saying,
such
I'm
as
just
was
saying these are
intended.
things that stuck out to me to maybe look at,
Yeah.
and it's up to you whether to take them or not.
Yeah.
D4, which was brought up before, reflect the scale and solid wall to void. I just wondered if that would be, the scale seems to be very determinative, and I wonder if it might be easier to meet that if it's something like a similar scale or proportional scale or something that's not just as determinative as the scale, because then we're talking about the ratio of an established character of the neighborhood, or that's what's desired in the general plan. So there seem to be a couple of different ways we're measuring it by, and so that was just something that stuck out to me.
Okay.
I think scale is probably the right word here, though, because
Yes.
you're really, it's in, the scale of established, and forget the and, for the scale of the established character of the neighborhood.
It's just the maybe a similar or something, instead of being so.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the reflect is kind of a
Okay,
subjective,
again,
right?
it's just
So
something that
that's-
stuck out to me in reading it, so just to raise it. I think at the end of that, section 4, that to add depth and dimensionality to the building facade, you could take that out. I think it opens up, you know, the point that people could argue, well, these 3 inches do not add depth and dimensionality. I mean, it just, you don't need it if you were going to say it's adding the 3 inches. So again,
With that, a lot of the reviews I've had internally have directed to be more to explain the intent behind the standard. So that was the reasoning to add that, is to explain why the standard exists. And so, you know, we tried to do that on throughout the ordinance, is to explain the purpose and the meaning behind the standard as well. But I can.
But does
Okay.
does that mean somebody could come in and say, well, mine are only 2 inches, but they still add depth and dimensionality? Or is 3 inches like, that's it, you know? 3 inches is it, right? So,
Yeah, and I think the 3-inch was the.
I think the 3 inches is clear, that it has to be clear, but someone could come in and say, well, it doesn't, I don't know. You just don't need it, and I think it opens up the room for argument. I think you can establish intent by having an intent statement earlier in the ordinance and say the intent of this standard is blah, blah, blah. And then where you're having your shall and your will and your here's what you have to comply with, you just leave it at that, and you leave the intent somewhere else. But again, that's up to you. These are just my comments as I was going through this.
Okay, thank you. I'll look at that.
I was curious, in E1, if the zoning districts where there is a designated ground floor requirement, are those typically required to be 75%? I just didn't know that offhand.
They range. So in D1, it's 90%. 75.
Was about mid-range?
It's about, yeah.
Okay.
It's about mid. It goes, the highest is 90. You see 80. There's a lot of 80%.
Okay.
So that was lower than our.
Lower
our
than what
max.
some
Yeah.
of them were? Okay, great. And then I had a question on E2 in those A, B, and Cs. And this may just be terms of art that I don't understand. So the significant changes in wall plane measuring at least 2 feet. Is there a way to clarify? I imagine that means 2 feet, like in and out and in and out, right?
Yep.
I don't know if there's a way to clarify that or if it needs to be clarified. Is that something that's clear to people in the industry that I would not know that that was clear? I'm seeing nods from behind you.
I think it's, yeah.
Okay.
I think it.
And then, so there's that or separating A, B, and C. And I just was reading this and I thought, okay, so if you have a distinguished roof line, but you don't have articulation in the wall itself, does that mean you could just have this long facade that's a flat wall, but you would have a roof line that's distinguished?
No, because the other standards would kick in. So then you have the standards under C, which speak to pedestrian interest, speak to active ground floor uses, transparency. So that would equate to windows. So those come into play to offset the additional standards under E. So when you have these, you can assume that there won't be a blank wall because you have the base standards in the 21A37, the design standards.
Okay.
And so between those and the rest of the standards that are required for all buildings,
Okay.
that should address.
Okay, and then in F, you say that this will be 3 of the 6 following elements, but you list 7
That's
elements.
a typo. I'll change that to 7.
And the 7th element is open-ended. It says other amenities that will provide a public benefit. So one, I think provide a public benefit is extremely subjective. And there are lots of ways people are going to assert something provides a public benefit, and we don't have any way to measure whether it does or it doesn't provide a public benefit, or to say definitively, sure, that does, or no, it doesn't. It's going to be based on individuals' opinions. But there are definitely more than 6, 3 out of 6. Like, I think that 6 needs to be removed.
Okay, well, there's 3 options, like there's 6 listed options.
There are 7, and 7 is open-ended, right? Or are you saying they have to have 3 of the listed ones, and then 7 is optional?
No, 7, if they need to have 3 total. So
Yeah,
I can
so
change
I
it
think
to, I
that
can change it
6
to
needs-
7. The 7 is intended to be open-ended.
Yeah.
Just so that we can leave it open, right? We didn't have any language for children's amenity space. That's a huge mayor initiative, or a
Yeah.
mayor priority. So that's been added, and
Right.
This
I think
is-
it's great to have the open-ended one. I just think public benefit is extremely subjective. And I don't know if there's a way to narrow that or come up with some objective criteria to help us understand where we're seeing public benefit and where we're not seeing public benefit, because that's going to be based every time on what someone's own subjective opinion is about what a public benefit is, right? So
yeah,
that's the only concern I have with that.
yeah, and I mean, design review in general it's still subjective. It's still a
Right.
subjective process, or design as a whole.
I think on that
do
one,
you-
at least, I actually think it's good to leave that open, because it's not like that's the only requirement. If it's one of 3, I think it would be more beneficial to leave that wide open to allow for some architect to come up with something that we can't foresee right now. And it's not like if that were the only thing, then I think it could be kind of a sneaky way to slip by it. But if it's 1 out of 3, I think it's better to kind of allow for that adaptability.
I think some objective criteria would be helpful as guardrails. So that's my only point on that. Let me see, I think that one is it. Yep, I think that's it.
Thank you.
Amanda, can you elaborate on the pedestrian interest assumption? So I just want to make sure that I understand what I read and then what you said. So if a plan meets all of the ground floor usages, et cetera, then there's the assumption that they are meeting the pedestrian interest. So then it would not be subject to further design review.
Well, no. I mean, they'd need to meet the rest of the standards. Just when reviewing it, you would mark that standard has been met, right? Because the standard speaks to.
Oh, in your review.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Not
That's
design
what I
review
understood.
as a whole. So as staff
Okay.
is reviewing it.
All right. Thank you. Well, if nobody's gonna speak, I'm all willing to make a motion.
Before you do, can I just make sure?
Yes.
Forward. The corner entrance, is there language that needs to be completely changed before moving forward? Or can I make slight modifications like to the and or just to make sure things are clear before moving forward to the planning commission? So if there is a big change.
So I'm not so concerned with wordsmithing into the motion. I think if you have direction of how you wish to proceed with those, if changing a word from and or whatever to whatever is more reflective of your intent that you've expressed in the report and in the briefings, I'm fine with that. If Commissioner Scheer or Commissioner Stott have a different idea on specific direction for corner entrances, that now would be the time for them to speak up before I do a motion, or they can do a motion, so we'd avoid a discussion and a friendly amendment. And that's fine. It's not something that I personally feel like needs to be spelled out, but they may disagree.
I'm good.
You're good. Okay. And I'm also good with leaving that open-ended. I don't know that, I agree with Commissioner Scott on that it's good to hear ideas. And then one day we may think that's, a good one, and the next day we may think it's not such a good one because we've seen it play out and it didn't play out well. That's kind of, after my tenure, I've seen certain things that just haven't gone the way that we had hoped. So at any rate, I will make a motion.
What do you need from us to, if we approve this as it is, what changes can you make? I don't want you to be in the position of feeling like there's something you need to do that you don't feel authorized to do. Question for Catherine.
We can look at the periods and.
I think the best course of action is to somehow reference the changes discussed by the Planning Commission so that then we have something to fall back on. Otherwise, we run the risk of substituting our judgment on what should change for what the Planning Commission's recommendation was.
Yeah, that's what I would worry
We want to
about.
avoid that.
Okay.
And I have I also want to pitch in on the comment of the standard being too open-ended. If we're okay with 2 out of 3 things being met, then I think we can approve it as it is. But if we think that there is, if 2 is not enough, then I think go with 3 of the other one, like make a requirement for 4 or something, just because I think there's going to be so many times when someone says, oh yeah, public benefit, kind of to her point of just like they can claim anything as a public benefit. And if we think 2 is enough and they claim random other thing, right? But I just want to make sure that we're clear that we are getting enough out of the deal.
I will
2.
say that there's been times when they've had to do 1 out of a list, if they met 1 thing, and we were tied. So I'm thrilled with 2 out of 3. But I think that's the point, is that our review is if an applicant says this is a public benefit, we are free to disagree with that. And if they're claiming that public benefit is one of their 2, and we do not agree that that's a public benefit, that's kind of our role, I believe.
Okay.
And that we can say, no, that's not, and we're not going to take that as you've met 2 out of the 3. And that would be a reason for us to then not let that pass a design review.
And then I just
But somebody may come up with an idea that we would never have thought of that is a pretty good public benefit. I don't know what that is.
Right. And I
Off the
value
top of my
that for
head.
sure.
And I just want to clarify on that standard is not a requirement. It says if provided. More often than not, it's not provided. So this is for, so really the projects that already go above and beyond.
Yeah. Okay. Based on the information presented and the discussion, I move that the commission forward a recommendation to approve or of approval to the city council for this text amendment with the additional direction that staff can review certain verbiage as long as it meets the intent of what staff has expressed in the briefings and in the report.
I'll second. I'd like to make it a friendly amendment. And staff may rely on discussion during tonight's planning commission meeting in their review and amendment.
Sure.
Sure.
We have a motion from Commissioner Berry, a second from Commissioner Scheer, and the friendly amendment from Commissioner Giel has been accepted. Any discussion to the motion? Let's take a vote. Commissioner Scheer,
Yes.
Commissioner Scott,
Yes.
Commissioner Barry,
Yes.
Commissioner Gale,
Yes.
Commissioner Kratzik,
Yes.
and Commissioner Burrows.
Yes.
And the chair also votes yes. That passes unanimously. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that concludes our regular agenda, and we will now move on to our briefings. Our first briefing is zoning consolidation project. Case number PLN PCM 2024-00706. And for planners, we have Kelsey Lindquist, and my mind just drew a blank, even though,
Chrissy Gilmore.
yes, thank you. It's really embarrassing when you forget someone's name that you've known for years.
Sorry, I usually have PowerPoint, so do you know how to make this full screen? I need to search for you. This is embarrassing.
It's the top.
Top button. Yeah, Erin,
Which one is that?
save me. Thanks. Oh, that's obvious now, but thank you. Yes. Okay, thank you. Well, this is a very content-heavy night for you all, so here's another big one. So I know you've had a few briefings on the MU mixed-use consolidation project, and we are back tonight to go over the lower scale zones, the MU 2 through MU 6. That's really, I'll just jump into it. I think you're well versed on what this project is, so I don't know if I need to go over those details, so we'll just jump into those zones. So as a reminder, the zones are generally organized by number of stories, so MU2 is generally 2 stories, and so on. And the proposed zones are organized in a form-based manner, where they're organized by building type, and each building type has its own set of standards. And so your cottage development, urban house, 2-family will have different setbacks, for example, than the storefront and vertical mixed use. And then actually to go over those different building forms, we have cottage development, urban house, 2-family, row house, which is like townhomes, storefront, vertical mixed use, and then multifamily residential. Then there are general standards that largely apply to all of the zones, and I wanted to go over before discussing the individual zones. So first is lot size. The proposed MU code removes the lot width and max lot area requirements for all of the zones. However, there is the addition of a maximum lot width of 110 feet for the MU2 and MU3 zones. And this is intended to try and keep those lower scale commercial properties and discourage combining lots of lots to make large buildings. And for an example, Immigration Market on 13th South is an example of about 110 foot lot width. The MU5 and MU6 zones do have that design standard where a building facade length can't go above 200 feet, but they don't have the lot width requirement that the lower zones have. As far as heights go, the consolidation attempted to keep building heights generally the same, though some zones may have slightly larger or slightly more height, such as the CN zone is currently at 25 feet, and then when it's consolidated into the MU2, it goes to 30 feet. And then setbacks. Setbacks will generally vary based on building type and the zoning of properties. Generally, the setbacks are higher in the lower intensity MU zones, where there is more of a development pattern of larger lots, versus the higher intensity zones where there's more of an urban development pattern. And then in addition to zone-specific setbacks, a 10-foot landscape setback and buffer is required when any of the MU zones abut a single-family or 2-family or multifamily zone. Maybe that'll help a little. And then, going back to the So front setbacks are based on the specific zone, but they're generally limited to encourage pedestrian engagement. Another addition to the new zone, the proposed zoning, is that outdoor dining or plazas may now be used to meet any maximum setback requirement or build-to requirement. So the only zone that doesn't have a maximum setback requirement is the 2. Then there are larger side and rear setbacks for lower scaled buildings. For the cottage, urban house, and 2-family and row house types, there is generally a 4-foot side and 10-foot rear setback. And then for the vertical mixed use storefront and multifamily zones, there is generally no side yard setback and a rear of 0 to 10 feet, depending on the adjacent property zoning. And then larger rear setbacks for lots. There are larger rear setbacks for lots more than 50 feet in some of the zones, which is primarily MU5 and MU6. And then MU5 and MU6 also have a setback, a 10-foot upper level setback if adjacent to lower scale zones. A new requirement or proposed requirement would be that 10% of the lot is designated as open space for all of the zones, with some building forms having an additional requirement of up to 20 to 25% of open space. This is a change, as many of the zones proposed to be consolidated have no open space requirements beyond existing setbacks. And one thing to note is that open space can include typical on-the-ground landscaping, but it can also include rooftop gardens, patios, and similar outdoor living spaces. They would have to be common, though. Private spaces would not count. And then lots without public street frontage. So the MU's consolidation would allow multiple buildings per lot for these zones and would allow new lots without street frontage, which you know is also a change because you see lots of planned developments for lots without street frontage. Affordable housing incentives would now apply to all zones. Right now, they do not apply to the MU zone, which is in the special purpose districts. So this project would apply them to all zones. Housing incentives would generally give every zone at least 1 extra story of height, but some would potentially go taller. And then mid-block walkways. The proposal would require mid-block walkways for all zones if they are identified on the general plan. So the MU2 zone. The MU2 zone consolidates the RB, CN, and SNB zones, and it allows all proposed building types. The RB zone is currently mapped around 1100 East between 13th South and 1700 South, and 900 South between 300 East and 500 East to 1000 East and 1100 East. The CN zone is generally mapped around intersections, so it's common on corner properties, and it's intended to support neighborhood-oriented commercial and small-scale restaurants. And then the purpose, like I mentioned, it's integrated in these small mixed-use developments with established neighborhoods to support that small local businesses. The height, so as you can see on this table, well, there's a lot on there, so you might not be able to see it too well. But the SNB and CN zones have a height limit of 25 feet, with 30 feet allowed in the RB zone. And to not reduce development rights of those properties, the proposed zone uses 30 feet as the height limit. And then setbacks. The existing zones vary in their setbacks, with CN generally allowing for buildings to be closer to the street, while RB and SNB zones regulations result in larger setbacks. The proposed MU zone attempts to replicate those setbacks by allowing buildings located on the block corners to be built close to the street at 5 feet, but otherwise buildings would follow the average of the block face. And I will note that we might make changes to that. We've had issues with using the average of the block face to calculate new development, and so you might see changes to that in your next iteration. And then the proposed side and rear setbacks are limited. No side or rear setbacks are required for storefront, multifamily, or vertical mixed buildings. And lower scale residential building forms require 4 feet side setbacks and 20 feet rear setbacks, which is similar to the adjacent residential zones. In all cases, a minimum setback of 10 feet is required when abutting a residential zone due to those landscape buffer requirements I mentioned earlier. And then design review and building limits. So both the RB and SMB zones include regulations intended to limit new construction of buildings, and they currently require conditional use or design review processes. Through those processes, they're required to make a finding that any building or place does not contribute to the character of the area, And the standards are generally difficult to meet, and it has resulted in very few new construction buildings in these zones. So through this process, the MU2 zone takes a different approach by requiring that any buildings or expansions over 5,000 square feet on the first floor or 10,000 feet overall go through design review process. And then you'll see in the code that there would be associated standards that deal with compatibility, like height, width, roof lines with other blocks on the block face, to ensure that we can get new development in those zones, but that it is compatible. And then the MU3 zone. So this zone consolidates the CB and RMU35. And again, all building types are allowed in this zone. So the existing CB is generally mapped over grocery stores, commercial properties on the edges of neighborhoods. And then the RMU zone is generally mapped over specific intersections and nodes in the West Side Community Plan area. So you can see on this map, there's a few clusters of the MU3 along Parley's Way, 200 South and 700 East, and then 900 South and 900 West. So the purpose of the MU3 zone is to provide up to 3 to 4 story moderately scaled commercial and mixed use development that is adjacent to low density residential neighborhoods. The table on the slide shows the existing and proposed MU3 standards. By right, the CB zone allows for a height of 30 feet, whereas the RMU 35 allows for 35 feet. The CB zone can gain additional 5 feet through plan development process, and similarly, the RMU 35 can gain additional 10 feet if a project goes through design review. So based on that context, and in order to not reduce the by right height, the MU3 zone is proposed for a height at 35 feet. With this change, applicants can still request an additional 5 feet of height through design or through plan development, and then they can also request up to at least an additional story through the affordable housing incentives. And then setbacks. Both existing zones have limited front setbacks from 0 to 5 feet with a maximum setback of 10 to 15 feet. The CB zone's limited setback is to encourage pedestrian-oriented development with active commercial uses close to the sidewalk. The MU 35 has similarly limited setbacks with the intent to create more urban neighborhoods. The MU3 replicates these setback requirements by requiring a minimum of 5 feet for lower scale residential uses, and then no front yard setback for larger structures, such as our mixed use housing or vertical storefronts. Side setbacks are in line with the existing setback requirements, but the rear yard requirement is reduced from the RMU 35 standard of 25% of the lot depth, which for the affected properties, that typically ends up to be about 30 feet. And brings it in line with the CB zone's 10 feet. However, for larger scale multifamily, storefront, or mixed use buildings, a 20-foot rear yard is required next to zones with a height of less than 30 feet to help buffer uses in those zones. And then similar to the MU2, the MU3 also includes building size limits that would require design review. The limit is 7,500 square feet or 15 for a footprint, or 1,500 square feet overall. And then the commercial requirements. So both the MU2 and MU3 zones include a commercial preservation requirement aimed at reducing displacement of local businesses, local and small businesses. The MU2 specifically prohibits replacing commercially used businesses with exclusively residential ones, such as townhomes or apartment buildings. It also requires an active ground floor use along every public street. Residential uses could be incorporated above the first floor or behind the front building, so they could have their mixed-use building and then a strictly residential building behind. And then similar to the MU2, the MU3 zone requires active ground floor uses, such as restaurants or retail, whenever a new building is replaced with an existing commercial building. However, otherwise, active ground floor uses are proposed to only be required at specific intersections or corridors. The reason is that the RMU 35 zone is mapped in large areas where commercial is likely not feasible, and the zone was intended to support some non-commercial development. And with that, I will turn it over to Kelsey.
Okay, I am going to cover the MU6, or the MU5 and the MU6. So the MU5 consolidates the FBUN2, which is the lower scale FBUN2, so about 50 feet in height, CC, CS, FBSE, TSAUNT, and MU. This context also includes the South State Street corridor overlay. This zone consolidates a wide range of zones, including components of the mentioned overlay. And to provide context for the consolidated districts, the following are the existing district purposes and general locations. Next slide. So the CC is aimed at automobile-centric arterial and major collector streets in support of commercial usage. It's generally mapped along State Street, Redwood Road, and 2100 South. The CS district generally supports and is mapped over large shopping centers such as Brickyard, Charlie Square, Redwood Plaza, and Foothill Village. The FBUN2 supports residential and lower intensity commercial uses, mapped in the area around 900 South and 200 West. And the MU5 does not include the FBUN2 block corners, which go up to 65 feet. The FBSE allows residential and lower intensity commercial uses and serves as a transition area next to lower scale neighborhoods. It is mapped along the S line from 500 East to 900 East, also at 2100 South and 7th East. TSA UNT supports residential and lower intensity commercial uses and serves as a buffer between higher intensity TSA zoning and lower scaled neighborhoods. Mapped along 400 South between 600 and 1000 East and North Temple between I-15 and 1000 West. The RMU 45 supports residential uses with lower intensity commercial uses also allowed. You'll find this zone mapped around key intersections in the West Side community and a few small areas across the city. The MU district, again, similarly supports residential uses with those smaller, low-scaled commercial buildings, and it's mapped along 3rd West between 300 North and 800 North. The State Street overlay, the SSSC overlay, is mapped along the State Street and reduces setbacks of the CC zone. Next slide, please. Okay, so the purpose of the MU5 zone is to implement the city's general plan in areas that identify mid-rise buildings, generally 5 stories or less in height, that contain a mix of land uses. So the table on the screen lists some of the key base standards of the existing and proposed zones. The MU5 is primarily based on the existing FBUN2, so the regulations are very similar. This district doesn't have a minimum lot width or size, and allowed building heights vary on building form. So as you'll see on the small chart, it's 40 feet for cottage, urban house, 2-family, and row houses. And the chart does say 50 feet, but it's 55 feet in height for all other forms. It's important to note that the downtown building height amendment did adjust the yard requirements for the FBUN2 district. And that includes both the 50 feet in height and the 65 feet in height. So we added requirements for front yards and side yards. Then specifically 10 feet for the front or corner side yard, and then 4 feet for the interior side yard. And those are specifically for certain building forms, but excluding multifamily. So the 2-family, the urban house, and the cottage. We have received some public comments that the yards are difficult to provide in the FBUN2 district. And there has been some requests that we adjust those. Staff does see the issue with providing the 4-foot side yard requirement because some of the lots are narrow in the FBUN2 district. But the front yard was specifically requested by the Central 9th community. And so we do not support reducing that required front yard setback. And we can discuss this further at the end of the presentation as well. This district requires 10 to 25% of open space, which is dependent on building form, and a step back when adjacent to a district that permits less than 30 feet in height. The MU5 zone is proposed to require active ground floor uses along certain corridors and intersections. These were chosen to generally reflect the existing areas where the consolidated zones require such uses, and they include 2100 South from 8th East to 13th East, 2100 south from West Temple to 300 west, 4 south, specifically within 100 feet of a block corner, and then North Temple from 6 west to I-215, and when located within 100 feet of a block corner, and then specifically 900 south. Specifically for 400 South and North Temple, the existing TSA zone mapped along these corridors requires active uses, or in place of those uses allows for residential if the ground floor shell space is built to accommodate commercial uses. The proposal narrows the required active use area down to block corners, acknowledging that retail and restaurant uses may not be viable across the entire corridor. It also removes the built to commercial standard requirement and instead requires all ground floor heights for larger scale buildings to be at least 12 feet, which can help accommodate commercial if viable in the future. Staff is also exploring additional areas where an active ground floor use requirement may be feasible and may add additional areas or revise the existing list. Next slide. The MU6 consolidates the FBUN2, the 65-foot allowance for block corners, FBSE, CSHBD2, RO, TSA UCT, TSA SPT, and TSA MUECT. To provide some context for the consolidated districts, I'm just going to go over their general purpose and the general locations. Next slide. The FBUN2 supports residential and lower intensity commercial areas, or commercial uses, and it is mapped around 900 South and 200 West, and includes the block corners. So similar to just the lower scaled FBUN2. The FBSE supports residential and lower intensity commercial uses, and that is mapped along 700 East from 2100 South to the S line. CSHBD2 supports residential and lower intensity commercial uses and is mapped in Sugar House, generally along 2100 South from 800 East to 1300 East. The RO supports residential and office uses, mostly mapped along South Temple from 500 East to 800 East. And the TSA UCT supports residential and lower intensity commercial and is mapped along 500 West from North Temple to 600 North. TSA SPT supports residential and then low to that medium intensity commercial, and you'll find that on the southwest corner of 100 or 1000 West and North Temple. TSA MUECT supports residential and low to medium intensity commercial. You'll see that in North Temple and Redwood Road intersections. Next slide. So the table displayed lists some of the key base standards for the existing and the proposed zones. MU6, similarly to MU5, is based on the FBUN2 district. So the regulations are pretty similar to the MU5. But it does have a higher height allowance. So similar to other zones discussed in the presentation, MU6 does not have an established lot width or minimum. And the height is approximately 40 feet for cottage, urban houses, two-family, and row houses. All other buildings allowed are allowed up to a height of 65 feet. This district also has a modified front yard requirement associated with FBUN2. This means that cottage, urban house, two-family, row house, and multifamily would require a 10-foot front yard setback, and that's the minimum. Other building forms allow 0 front yard. And then there is also an interior side yard of 4 feet for cottage, urban house, two-family, and row house. The side yard is not required for the other building forms. There is a required side yard when abutting a lower scale district. And then there is a range of 10 to 25% of open space requirement. And then to reduce the impact to abutting lower scaled properties, there is a required step back of 10 feet. It's important to note that the MU6 does not carry over many of the specific regulations within the Sugar House Central Business District. And these include removing the threshold for design review. So currently the CSHBD2 requires that buildings over 30 feet in height or over 20,000 square feet in floor area go through design review process for approval. This effectively requires a design review process for most new buildings in the zone. And no other zones in the consolidation have a similar design review threshold, and instead allow a development up to the maximum height of the zone without such a process. So the proposed district requires compliance with several measurable design standards that are intended to achieve similar design outcomes without requiring a discretionary process. Because of how comprehensive the design standards that are proposed to apply to the MU6 are, the zone does remove the requirement for design review. Applicants seeking modifications to the design standards would be required to go through that design review process. We are also proposing to remove the step back requirement along the streets. The CSHBD2 does require that any floor above 30 feet in height be stepped back at least 15 feet. This pushes the building mass located above 30 feet in height away from the street. No other zones in the consolidation have a similar step back requirement. The proposed design standards as part of the MU zone changes remove this requirement, and instead, a general step back requirement applies to buildings over 85 feet in height, which would effectively not require a step back for the CSHBD2 zone. Non-residential use floor area compensation removal. The CSHBD2 zone requires that any non-residential square footage located between 30 to 60 feet in height, that's typically the 3rd through the 5th floor, be compensated with residential square footage in the same building or another building in the same zone. Such floor space would typically be office. There has been very little office development in the zone since the regulation was implemented. This could have been due to regulation or due to lack of demand. The proposed zone eliminates the requirement, allowing for additional office development in the area. Ground floor uses include the same requirement for active ground floor uses along certain streets and intersections. So in addition to the areas listed in the MU5, the MU6 zone adds the following additional areas where active ground floor uses are required. 1100 East from Hollywood Ave to 2100 South, 2100 South from 800 East to 1300 East, and these additional areas mirror the current CSHBD2 active use requirement. Next slide. Okay. We are taking the opportunity with this project to clarify some of the existing design standards. For example, the amendments to Chapter 37 as part of the Downtown Building Height Amendment created some challenges to applying the ground floor use activation requirements. To address this issue, staff is proposing to clarify the language to include more specific active uses. So we do list, I'm happy to read the code, but I'm also aware that that's a lot of me talking. So I would just point it out in your staff report that the design standards are being amended for qualifying active uses to list specific uses. And then we do provide the allowance for the planning director or the planning commission to consider other uses that are substantially similar. And then we are allowing building lobbies to occupy up to 25% or 50 feet, whichever is less. Building lobbies were the main issue with that prior amendment because the active use was so stringent that building lobbies were not being able to be achieved. Outdoor active uses, so outdoor space may count up to 25% of the required ground floor use, and that's if the outdoor space is within a required or provided front or corner side yard. And then vehicle entry and exit are exempt from the active ground floor use calculation, and spaces that are not considered active, we also get fairly specific on this, include residential amenity space, and bicycle storage kitchens or utility space. We are also establishing a base ground floor height of 12 feet unless a higher requirement is established in the base district. Clarifying what is considered a durable material, requiring entry features, clarification of upper floor step backs, and we are introducing public improvement requirements, including sidewalks, curb gutter, and park strips. And then, as mentioned, I believe in the beginning, each building form has a different design standard requirement. So just to go into each, the urban house, 2-family, and cottage development Building types require very few design standards. The row house buildings do require a minimum of 50% of ground floor activation, 50% upper floor durable materials, 50% or 15% transparency in required building entrances, and there are several other applicable design standards. Multifamily storefront and vertical mixed use increases the requirement of ground floor activation to 75%, 70% of upper floor durable materials, among many others. Next slide. That was a lot of information. For more information, please visit our website. We have all of our mixed use consolidation drafts on our website. As we update code language, we replace those drafts. We also have the story map where you saw each zone. You can click on those and actually zoom in and see what the regulations are. We're ready for questions.
So just to not confuse or maybe maybe untangle things a little bit.
Yeah.
When you say design standards that are for each, there's this, okay. So there's the design standards we just sent to city council, right? And that's if these other things are somehow not working.
That's
for
the
the
design
applicant.
review.
Huh?
That's design review.
Right, but
Yes.
there's standards, there are design review standards, right? Okay. Design standards here in these contexts mean both design and use standards as well, right? Because it's ground floor uses and blah, blah, blah. So it's not just design standards. And some of the design standards are not really design standards. They're really just kind of mass. I mean, they're not, you know. Right. So if you pass all of these standards, and that's a staff review, correct?
That's a building permit.
Okay. And the building permit guys, the building department sends it to you if they don't pass it. So who's evaluating it is what I'm asking.
Yeah, our reviewers. So on staff we have our
In the planning,
in the planning
not
division.
in the building.
So when somebody submits for a building permit, it's routed to all of the applicable divisions and departments, right?
Okay.
Public utilities, engineering,
Yeah.
everybody.
Okay.
We're included on that.
Okay.
Yeah, so we have a staff of 5 or 6 that are dedicated to permit reviews.
Okay. And so if they pass the standard, so there's two kinds really. There's the MU6, everybody, everything in there always goes to, you know, these things. And then there's specific ones for each, specific standards for each building type.
There are specific standards. So the way that we're applying the design standards, it's a little different compared to the other districts, whereas like you'll just see D1, D2, D3, D4, and then like an X or a number, if that's applicable. The way that we have this drafted is that it's based on building form. So cottage, you'll see like cottage, urban house, and 2-family are all listed together. And then you have the districts. There will be an X or a number if that standard is applicable. The design standards tend to increase in requirements as the building form increases in intensity. What would trigger a design review, what you just heard from Amanda, is if somebody's not meeting a design standard. So they can't meet an entry requirement, they can't meet their transparency, or they're choosing to not implement durable materials, that would kick them through the design review process.
Right. And so if an applicant pretty much followed the standards according to the person who's reviewing it, then we won't see it.
Mm-hmm.
Yay. Less agenda. But also the public won't see it either.
Correct. Yeah, there's no public process associated with.
Okay. So this, presumably, I mean, one of the purposes of this is to actually make this a little bit more standardized, but also have less projects that sort of have little bits of things that don't work that have to come here.
Yeah, like odd triggers for planning commission review or for design review or for a random plan development requirement for any
More
new
rando
construction.
stuff, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
All right.
it just creates consistency.
Thank you.
This is the first time I've understood that there's a zone and then also a building form, and those two interact. Is that true for the higher scale MU2, for MU11 and 8 and
For
all
all
those
of
two?
them. Yeah, it's true for all of them. The MU11 doesn't allow some of our lower intensity type of housing units, though.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, it's true for all of them. It's arranged the same way by building type.
Okay, I'm going to go back and apply that understanding to all the stuff I heard before.
It's a lot.
Okay, let's start with the Sugar House Business District 2 elimination stuff. So the only one that concerns me is eliminating the residential ratio, and that we could make it only office. So in Sugar House Business District 1, we do have office and we have had some built, etc. We haven't had very much built in Sugar House Business District 2. So I think the reasoning applied is apples and oranges, because Business District 1 is different. The redevelopment that I can think of in Business District 2 has been residential in nature, but along 11th we do have the, because I want to reference it, I can't remember the name of it, but we do have office on the bottom and then condos on the top next to the gas station. I think that heavy office in Sugar House Business District 2 is not what we want to see. I think more office focused in Business District 1, and I think that's going to MU11, if I'm right.
Yes.
Oh, okay. And so I think that's fine. That can absorb it, and we have some strictly office buildings within that zone already, and old and new. But I think Business District 2 is more of this. Well, if we want to maintain kind of that more of a downscale and a buffer to the residential and have it be more quaint and interactive, I think having a mixed use with residential on top and some office on the bottom for new construction is something that I think we want to consider keeping. How we define that, it doesn't have to be as complex as it is right now in the code or in the zoning, but I don't think that a strictly office building in Business District 2 is extremely compatible or with the vision of what we wanted to create there.
Okay.
Those are my thoughts on that. And then I want to go back to the CN zone, which would be MU2. So I didn't stop you while you were talking, so I may have missed part of it, or as I was writing and you were talking. But when we talk about this setback, the front yard setback, so new construction would have a limited front yard setback. But then you referenced something about you would allow for outdoor dining, etc. So can you go back and explain that? Because as you were talking, I was writing and I knew I was missing this particular question that I'm wondering. Because what I would like to get out for those CN zones, one of the interesting things, and this falls within Sugar House Business District 2 zones, is that we have some small scale commercial that were existing buildings, and so they have setbacks. And I know you guys have talked about the activation of those, and one of them has made it into a really robust outdoor dining area. Another one, it's still a yard, but they use it for pop-up events, and so there'll be vendors outside, and those are really great spaces that interact well with the neighborhood. So as CN gets folded into MU2, if we get a new building in those areas, I'm wondering if then they propose to have space for those types of activations that we allow for additional front yard setbacks. So if they say, hey, I'm just going to make up a number, 15 feet setback, but I'm going to do this with it, and it meets the intent of activating for the neighborhood, is that something that we're going to continue to allow? Because I think having variations of that front yard setback in an MU2 zone is a good thing because we don't want everything to be the same. But in my particular neighborhood, where we have some retail that's closer to the street versus the ones that aren't, nothing goes on those. There's no activation, and there's no, other than people go into the business and they leave, but there's no like community gathering spaces. And so will you clarify if that additional setback would be allowed for a new construction in an MU2?
So when I was talking about the outdoor dining, things can be in that setback. So I was referring to a maximum setback. So some of the zones, which is not MU2, have a maximum setback, or where the building has to be to that setback to encourage the streetscape. The MU2 doesn't have that requirement. So the MU2 has a minimum setback of 5 feet, but they can go further back if they'd like and include, outdoor dining or those uses in that setback.
I wonder if it is worthwhile to specify that, if you want additional setbacks, because I'm looking at the table for MU2. Hold on.
It says, so if you see the min, it's even up on the screen.
Front.
So if you look at your screen, it says minimum front.
Fires glasses.
Yeah, it's 5 feet on corners, and then otherwise it's the average, the block face, and then just the next row is the max, meaning there is none. So somebody can set their building back where they choose, as far back if they wanted to do like an outdoor dining
Do they
area.
need to specify what? I mean, I guess if we do it this way, they could just have grass, but it would be kind of nice if we allowed for a maximum. Or we allowed them to have whatever they felt they needed for something that was an active use. That could be an activated, whether it's outdoor dining or a space where they intend to do community gathering, pop-up markets, etc. That we're not just saying, you can go back as far as you want on the front yard, that we have a qualifier. Like, you can go back as far as you want. What's your plan, and how is this going to be an active use for a community space or community gathering for your business and the community, if that makes sense?
That makes sense, and we can take a look at modifying that language.
I would be concerned about that because, some person could come in there and they decided they're going to have, knitting circle in the front yard, and that's going to be great. And then that business goes out of business right after the building's built because it's a knitting circle. And then it doesn't make it. And then you have that space that's not gonna, that's permanently there. So uses are very flexible, as we know.
Wouldn't it be already, like, if that space were there, then they could just turn it into grass? I mean, I guess I'm just curious
But
why.
that's a setback you're allowing. That's not part of the allowed setback, is what I'm saying.
No.
If you're suggesting that we allow setbacks in MU zones for special uses,
Okay.
that are not considered here, then
Okay.
I have a problem with that.
Well, I don't want her to have a problem with it, but I don't want to see that everything then just becomes as close to the street as possible, because we lose these really interesting and active and community gathering spots that make a neighborhood active. We lose those spaces. So I have a problem with trying to push everything up to the street in an MU2 zone, because those existing CN spaces that are neighborhood draws and retail draws, I don't want to see us create a vision here where we're not allowing them to occur for new construction.
The MU2 zone does allow, right? It allows.
I'm only
Okay.
specifying my concern, Commissioner Scheer. I'm not prescribing any direction.
No.
Other
I'm-
than
I'm just saying
that.
that right now, what they have proposed is that the MU2 zone doesn't have a maximum front yard setback.
I understand that. My next part that I want to finish with is one of the points that you talked about was like lots without street frontage wouldn't trigger a design review, which I think is fine on its face value, actually. But that still wouldn't preclude then what is facing the street has to meet all those design standards. Would you still have certain, because one of the points we look at when we see those come before a design review is kind of some circulation and how things are, massing is broken up with that. Would you still have that review internally?
So the lots without street frontage, it says that they can have lots without street frontage provided they go through our subdivision process. And that subdivision process does look at connectivity,
Okay.
Those types of things.
I just wanted to clarify that because I'm perfectly happy not seeing those in the future. Thank you.
On that, how, for lots without street frontage, do you have to like declare what part of the lot then is going to be the front for things like side setbacks and rear setbacks?
Yeah, they would, depending on the orientation there, sometimes it gets tricky, but the applicant would let us know what the front is, and then we would review and see if we agree with it matches our definitions for a front.
Okay, cool. And then a couple other things. I know we've talked before about how going to the kind of MU2 is roughly 2 stories, or MU6 is 6. I still think it would be good to just do that, but I think that if we're doing that with a mixture of height limitations as well, some of them are a little low and might end up with developers kind of squeezing out pretty small stories for residential. So particularly in MU5 and 6, where I think it's 55 and 65. You talked about like a 12-foot minimum for commercial, but for like when I've done projects like that before, like for retail space, you'll generally want at least 14 feet, if not more, on the first floor, and that's clear, not floor to floor, so you'll end up with 16 or sometimes 18 feet in that first story. And so once you take that out, you can end up with only 9 foot floor to floor to get the rest, and depending on how the parapet's dealt with. But I worry that we might end up with kind of squeezed floor to floor heights in residential, and I think that I would like to encourage those to be taller rather than kind of squished. Do driveways count as open space?
No, typically they do not. And when in our landscape chapter, they don't count in the percentage. So like, for example, the 30% in our single family zones, the front yard is typically 30% open space. They don't count the driveway in that.
Yeah, I was thinking in particular of townhouses where it's a driveway all on one side. And so if that counts, it would be all of the open space. So that's good. This is kind of an overall thing, but how is mixed use as a term defined? Is it its own land use, or is it a definition that says it's a combination of however many land uses?
Well, thanks for asking. I actually just had a conversation about this yesterday. We do currently define mixed use. It's just a combination of commercial and residential uses. I believe we likely define that because of our lower scale kind of residential business districts. We're really prescriptive about allowing residential units associated with commercial uses. So you'd have commercial and then like one unit. So it's really limiting. There's been some discussion about potentially deleting the mixed use definition. Are we past the point of really needing it? Because all of the uses that we're hoping to achieve are allowed in the districts and in the land tables or in the land use table. So I don't know if that answers your questions, but we do currently have a definition in our code for mixed use.
Okay. I asked just because I've seen it both ways in different codes, and sometimes it does leave it open to kind of a weird ambiguity where if mixed use just means one thing and another thing, then you can kind of pick 2 land uses out and put them on top of each other, and like it can be kind of a weird thing to leave open. So that's why I just wanted to bring that up. And then The last thing, I think it might be good to include kind of like a footnote or asterisk or whatever in some of these new tables for showing kind of building height or lot coverage or whatever that points to things like the adaptable reuse things, or like the what's the other one that passed, the
Affordable housing.
the affordable housing. Just because I think that if you don't know that, then it's hard to kind of go to that. And I think if those are things we want to promote, then we should make it as easy as possible to say, do this. I particularly thinking of that just because the MU5 CC is where I see a lot of development happening. What would have been CC would then be MU5. And so I think there's a lot of kind of warehouse spaces and interesting old industrial spaces that it would be really easy to tear down and put something completely new on, where I think we would end up with a lot more interesting city if those are kept and incorporated somehow. So I think it would be good to kind of point to those where we can, so that we try and encourage adaptable reuse and affordable housing initiatives.
We can look at adding something like that. And then just for background for the commission on the planning division, we actually do meet with any property owner or developer on Thursdays. We have meetings they can schedule where we can sit down and go over their site, and we generally use those to bring up their options and go over the affordable housing incentives and other options they have for development than just the strict zoning.
Thanks.
I'm with Commissioner Scott on the building height, floor to floor height. And I'm just wondering if there's some kind of way we can reward, a 10% allowance for additional floor to floor height. So it's generally 5 stories, and it's generally 55 feet or 60 feet or whatever, but it, you can have 10% more if you're doing more floor to floor. Or maybe it's 15% more or something. There just needs to be a way that people are not squeezing the floors down to make that, so that we do reward people who have a higher floor to floor on all the floors, not just the first floor, but all the floors. So, yeah, that we've talked about that before, but some way to do that.
We can look at that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You'll see us next meeting.
Yes. And probably the one after that and the one after that.
We are now moving to item number 2 on briefings, R1 zoning study. And we'll be hearing from Nick Norris. And I do see Aaron Barlow there.
Aaron's my backup for the hard questions. So this is a briefing for the Planning Commission on a study that the City Council requested regarding our R1 zones. Specifically, this was a request from last year, last fall. The City Council wanted us to look at what it may take to combine the R1 zones. We currently have 3 R1 zones, and we'll get into a lot of this detail as we go through this. But combine those into one, and then consider options to create more housing, which may include, but not necessarily be limited to, reducing minimum lot sizes, reducing or removing minimum lot widths, easing flag lot standards, and allowing attached single-family dwellings, otherwise known as townhomes, in all zones. They also asked that on the city's major streets that we look at finding ways to increase residential density and mixed-use development. That last part is kind of pending the changes to the MU chapters. So we're not going to discuss the mixed-use development aspect in this presentation. They also, as part of this, wanted us to consider the impact of doing such on various policies that the city has adopted, including the items listed here, which are found sometimes as, for example, with Thriving in Place, that's its own standalone document. But most of these other items are found embedded in our other plans that collectively comprise the city's general plan. So the study starts with the history of the R1 zoning. Some of you may know this, but the city's first adopted a citywide zoning code in 1927. There were, I think, 7 zoning districts, 30 pages roughly of code. And the lowest intensity zone was this residential A zone in the areas shown in orange on the screen. And then these are the land uses that it allowed. One of the interesting aspects about the 1927 zoning code is that it also included a provision that said any existing lot prior to 1927 could have, I think it allowed anything up to the residential C zone, which that zone includes apartment buildings and things like that. The zone, there were no minimum lot widths and things like that. Setbacks were based on a proportion of the building height. So quite a bit different approach than current zoning. By 1948, we had our first exclusive single-family residential zoning district. It was called AA, located in the Federal Heights neighborhood. You can see that highlighted in yellow on the map. In 1958, that expanded to include most of the portion of the avenues that's east of what is currently about 13th Avenue. You can see in there a few of those curvilinear streets that had been platted. I believe this was prior to any development occurring east of 13th Ave. By 1994, so over about a 40-year period, the R1 zone had expanded, but maybe not expanded in areas where people traditionally think of where it would be. So just starting up the upper left side of the map, that's the area that's west of Redwood, in between Redwood and I-215. And then just moving clockwise around the map, you can see the Capitol Hill area, again, the avenues. Now you can see many more platted streets up there. Portions of the East Bench east of Foothill Boulevard, and then finally portions of land in the Glendale neighborhood, south of 900 South. It was 1995 where the R1 zone was expanded to incorporate the areas shown on the map. The areas circled in red are those areas that prior to 1995 allowed other types of housing. You can see that's a pretty significant portion of the city where the R1 zone is currently mapped, that was essentially downzoned from what was the R2 designation. Some of these were also some of the RMF, the precursors to the RMF zones that were downzoned too. So from there, we move on to the options. And as we looked at this, consolidating the R1 zones into just, for example, the R1 5000 zone really would not create a noticeable amount of new housing. And the primary reason for that is because you would still, to create a new dwelling unit in an R15, you still need a total of 10,000 square feet, and you would need at least 100 feet in lot width. And there's just not a lot of properties that have that, and most of them that are tend to have big, huge homes on them, and they're highly unlikely to be changed. Where you might see some housing built is on these properties that have very large lots, where they don't require the demolition of the home to build an existing home. So usually a very small footprint home, and where the land is worth more than what the existing building is on there. The key benefit of consolidating the R1 zones is to simplify the zoning code. Reducing lot sizes is kind of a unique situation, the key takeaway here is more than a third of the R1 zones in the city don't currently meet their minimum lot size. As you go up in size, that number of lots that don't meet it increases based on the percentage. So in the table, you can see that there are more than 12,000 R1 5,000 zoned lots that exceed the minimum lot size, which means there's more than 4,000 that don't meet it. And so that's about 27%, all the way up to, in the R112 zone, 45% of the lots are under the minimum lot size. What the zoning code currently says that if you are, if you have a lot that does not meet the minimum lot size of your zone, you are allowed to utilize the R1 5000 zoning district regulations. So for example, if you're in the R1 12,000 zone and your lot is 11,000 square feet, you get to use the R1 5000 zone regulations already. So our code already somewhat addresses this. One key aspect about everything with these lots is that most lots in the city, with the exception of some areas where there's a concentration of lots or of parcels, were created through a subdivision process. That means they are in a platted subdivision. In order to create new lots within a platted subdivision, you have to go through a subdivision amendment. If you're a parcel, so a parcel is a piece of land that was created just by a legal description or some other legal means. Historically, new lots were created when somebody, for example, had a court order to pay back a debt. They would order that property owner to give someone portions of their lots. Suddenly a new lot was created. That was a legal means in the city for creating lots. So for the lot size options, we created this table that lists the pros and cons, the level of, the degree of impact, really, not really the pros and cons, the degree of impact of whether it produces more housing, the level of controversy, the staff resources necessary to make the change, and then whether or not it simplifies the code. So these were all things that the city council identified that they wanted us to do, and they wanted us to give them some feedback. So on this table, it goes from making no change all the way down to eliminating the minimum lot sizes. And as you go down the table and lower that minimum lot size, the likelihood of producing more housing units increases, the level of controversy increases, the staff resource pretty much stays the same through all that. And then simplifying the code also gets improved the lower you are because you're eliminating regulations. Lot widths, so a little bit of history in the lot widths. Is I think most people involved in the world of planning and development in the city know that we're based off of, a good chunk of our city was platted based off the Plat of Zion. And it used the term perch to describe the dimensions of lots. A perch was also commonly called a rod, and you can see the dimensions of those listed here. And you start to see how they relate to our urban structure. So our street widths, our streets initially were anywhere from 66 to 132. So 4 rods, 1 chain or 2 chains wide. And then you start to see our block lengths. So a lot of our original lots were based off of that. And so that's why when we look at a subdivision plat, we'll see lot widths of 33. So 2 of those perches or rods, 49.5, 66, etc. The 25-foot lot appears to become more in favor starting in the early 1900s, which likely led to, one, it was just an easier, more common, people had a better idea of what a 25 feet was versus a rod, right? And so that probably led to our current regulations of lot widths based on 25-foot measurements, with the one weird exception, the R1 12,000 of 80 feet, which frankly we have no idea where that came from. So one of the things that has happened with our zoning by going to the current measurement is that we have a lot of lots that do not comply with the minimum lot widths. Again, with lot width options, this really is three things. Leave it as is, reduce it to something that tries to accommodate more of our existing lots, or even eliminate lot widths, and whether or not those are even necessary anymore. You can see similarly the more drastic the changes, the more likely it is to produce more housing. The flag lot rules in Salt Lake City. So first we're going to start with what a flag lot is. And this image from our zoning code demonstrates that, but it's basically a lot that has a small access strip that goes from the street to usually a lot that's behind another lot. And so it looks like the shape of a flag. So we have the pole portion, which is usually the access strip, and then the flag part, which is usually where the home and the main yards are. And so we have some pretty drastic or pretty large requirements for flag lots, and one reason why we rarely see these. But you essentially need enough land area to accommodate the minimum lot size in the zone for the lot that's at the along the street, plus 1.5 times that size to create the flag lot. And so as a result, if you're in the R1 5000 to create a flag lot, you actually need 12,500 square feet. There's a very small percentage of R1 5000 lots in the city that accomplish that, or that meet that. And then all the way up to 30,000 square feet in an R1 12 zone. One of the key things to keep in mind is this is a situation where zoning regulations and fire code regulations start to really mix, in that fire code requires the home to be able to be serviced from the fire access road, which is almost always the street. The whole perimeter of that house has to be within 150 feet. So when you have to have a 18,000 square foot lot, you're probably not going to be able to do that, which ends up making the access strip wider, so that can be your fire access. Flag lot options, we don't see any changes to the flag lots actually producing a high level of housing, just simply because of the nature of the other codes. However, we do think that something similarly, and this would be allowing lots without street frontage, could produce more homes. And this is because it creates some more flexibility in that rear lot size and the distance it may be from the street. And it could open the door, for example, for people to actually sell what would be an ADU, to subdivide it off and actually have it be a for sale product. It could be accomplished with both detached and attached ADUs. And there are some communities that have started to do this around the country. The last thing that the council asked us to look at was allowing attached housing. So this includes duplexes, row homes, townhomes, et cetera, whatever, however you want to call it. And this is this is the map that shows where, in red, attached housing could be built. In blue, 2-family, and then the yellow are areas where we're limited to single family. And one of the key takeaways from this map is you'll notice those red areas and some of the blue areas are commercial zones, which means housing is competing at commercial land values with much larger potential development. So usually the townhome, the duplex, et cetera, is going to lose out to something larger. And so it's one of the ramifications of allowing that use mostly in those zones is we get less of that type of housing. So this there's a number of different options. The first was allowing these types of housing in the R1 zones, which could happen. It would require writing specific regulations for those types of dwelling units because they're not going to fit within the standards for a detached home. And the other is to just rezone the R1 zones to something that already allows these. And fortunately, in Salt Lake City, we have a couple of zones that have produced the attached housing more than others. And so we looked at some of those. Again, I just discussed this, but these were the regulations that would likely have to change if we were to just simply allow single-family attached within an R1 zone. And so we looked at what happens if we were to do this, do a number of different scenarios here. So this first one is, what if the minimum lot size was reduced to 3,000 square feet and we reduced setbacks and essentially eliminated the lot coverage. The outcomes here is that we increase the opportunity for small lot homes. Smaller yards require less outdoor water uses, which is one of our significant uses of our culinary water. And it increases new residents within existing neighborhoods. With this table, so the 3 R1 columns reflect the current regulations, and then the right-hand column demonstrates what could change. So what I really want to point out is that third row down, labeled buildable area, and then the row right below that, the max lot coverage. So within our R1 zones, there's a max lot coverage. That means the total percentage of the lot that can be covered by buildings. Does not include things like patios or driveways. These are buildings with a roof, so the home, garages, sheds, etc. And what you see is that there is a difference between the max lot coverage and the buildable area. The buildable area is the space on the lot that can be developed after the setbacks are applied. And so when you have a lower max lot coverage, you see more of the lot essentially having to be some sort of landscaping. And so even though in the R1 12,000 zone, you'd have a 6,500 square foot buildable area roughly, the code only allows you to build on 4,200 square feet of that. And then it goes down from there. The benefit of reducing the minimum lot size of 3,000 square feet, which is a smaller lot, and eliminating that max lot coverage, is that you do create an opportunity where a small lot could be feasible. So you can see that once you apply those setbacks and they are reduced, sometimes, for example, the front is cut in half, the side, one of them stays the same, one of them is reduced by 4 feet, and the rear yard stays the same as it would be in R1 5000, but you create a 1,600 square foot buildable area. That's big enough for a home that could be feasibly constructed. If we were to compare the R1 zone to the SR3 zone, so this is a scenario where if the R1 zones change to SR3, there would have to be this also assumes in the R1 zone a minimum lot size of 2,000 square feet, but all of the other regulations, setbacks, lot coverage, et cetera, staying the same. So this is intended to show what happens if you only change that lot size, and then compared it to what could happen in the SR3 zone. So this is a real lot, just under 4,800 square feet. If you could divide this into 2, so you would eliminate or reduce that minimum lot width to 35 feet, you could get 2 lots. They'd be 2,380 square feet, so 35 by 68. In the max lot coverage at 60% in the SR3 would create a buildable area of just over 1,400 square feet, while in the R1, modified R1, it would be 952. And then once you apply the setbacks, I think those rows are a little backwards, but the difference that you see between the max lot coverage and the buildable area, I believe that the numbers are different, but have been reversed. You can see that the R1 zone does not produce a feasible buildable area of 448 square feet, whereas the SR3 is a more feasible area. So we also looked at the FBUN1 zone. So this is one of the form-based zones that is mostly mapped in the Central Ninth neighborhood. We compared it to what the code requires. This is a real project that was built, and it's attached housing. So this is a row house. And then what would happen if this property were R1 5000? So you could see how it compares to the R1 5000 zone. At the end of the day, in the FBUN1, you could potentially get 4 homes, whereas in R15 you get 1. A straight following of the FBUN1 zone would require 10% open space on this property, so there's 660 feet. This, in just the front yard, which you can see, and the side yards, has about almost 1,500 square feet. And it doesn't occupy all of the buildable area. Part of that is because they provide parking in the rear yard. This is another project about a block away, which came to the Planning Commission as a planned development. And this is an example of a relatively small footprint home on a large lot. And so utilizing the FBUN1 zone, this project was able to preserve the existing home, build a second detached dwelling next to it, and then behind it build 3 townhomes. So this property actually has 5 family-sized homes on it. Parking is from an alley. And so we looked at this as what would it look like to have some sort of provision that allowed small lot infill development. So this we could potentially accomplish this without actually changing any of the zones. It may be something like an incentive, like with our affordable housing incentives, or some sort of an overlay. But you could establish a minimum lot size, address the setbacks. One of the key provisions is having a maximum dwelling size. And so this next slide that we're going to go through is an example from Durham, North Carolina, which took this approach in with some pretty, what we think were some pretty noticeable results. So in Durham, they have a minimum lot size for this option of 2,000 square feet. They capped the max dwelling size. Aaron can correct me, but I believe it was a max footprint of 800 and a max overall size of 1,200. This was adopted in 2019. Since then, they've had 215 small lot homes built. And most of those were built in neighborhoods where there were lower wealth households compared to some of the other neighborhoods. And Durham also tracked what was demolished as part of that to see what was happening, and there was no noticeable difference in terms of what was being demolished for small lots versus the normal, following the typical zoning. But the real telling piece is in that right-hand column. So the median sales price of a home that was built or existing in their typical single-family dwelling, $605,000, where the homes that use the small lot were, whatever that math is, $257,000 cheaper. And so we presented this yesterday to the city council, and I think that they kind of universally acknowledge some of the issues with our current zoning, R1 zoning. What they asked of us is to make a recommendation on what we thought was the best approach to achieve a couple of goals. And those primarily were more attainable housing and simplifying our zoning code. And so over the next probably 2 months while we have some, as we get the zoning consolidation a little further along in the process, we have capacity to put together a more solid recommendation to them. We'll do that. And we're also happy to come back to the Planning Commission with that so you can weigh in as well. The idea is that the city council would then consider initiating some sort of change to our code if they feel so inclined to add something to address those two goals. So that's the presentation. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you.
So, one of the key issues, one of the issues I think, is sort of access to a rear, and I'm wondering if there could be something in the code that refers to lots that have alleys, and whether or not that would be more encouraged in those situations where there's rear access, like the one you were showing where the parking's in the back, and that's a lot less of a controversy, I think, and we're seeing a lot more ADUs in that situation too. So it would seem like there might be some situation where it would be different if you have an alley. There's a lot of alleys
Yes.
in Salt Lake, and knowing how many lots, I don't know how many lots there are, obviously, but on alleys, but I think a lot of people fear all this parking on the street and traffic that's, that's visible.
Yeah, there has to be a way to accomplish that.
I love this idea of reducing lot sizes, making it so we can have small lots. I definitely think that avoiding flag lots and trying to just do the kind of full split lot with an easement or an alley access. My concern with like limiting towards just alley access is that I know there's a lot of development in like Glendale and a lot of areas on the west side where just we don't have as many alleys as a lot of the places on the east side do, and so I think if it was focused around something like that, we would end up losing out on a huge opportunity for a lot of development, and so that's my 2 bits on that element. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think I had the same thought about alleys being something to target with that, because I think the main kind of practical concern I would worry about is utility access. As someone who has found out that they shared a sewer line with their neighbor and had to hire a lawyer about it, it actually is an enormous pain to have your sewer line even just running over someone else's property, and the access easements required, and there's, it's kind of a whole nightmare on its own. So I think that there does need to be some kind of access, both pedestrian and circulation, and also utility wise, for that. And then, oh god, I just blanked out on the other thing. You were going to say something. I'll see if I remember.
Yeah, one thing that some cities have done is with their flag lots is that they only require the flag to be for utilities. And so they're only like 5 feet wide, which looks really funny, but they come out to the street. So each property, each lot would have its own utility access. And that's something obviously we would work with public utilities on to see what's acceptable for them. Right now, for example, on a lot of townhome projects, there's still just one utility connection, and then it's sub-metered by the developers, and that sub-meter is a private type of thing, but part of all of their due diligence is creating the methods to ensure that everyone has access and maintenance down the road.
Yeah. I think that's a good solution on the kind of flat, if it is just the flag lot is for utilities. The other thing, looking at the numbers that you were talking about in comparing buildable area versus kind of what was it, buildable versus,
Yeah, buildable area versus maximum lot coverage.
yeah, versus lot coverage. I think on those numbers, a lot of them where it was like the difference is, 1,200 to 1,600. I think that just means someone builds a house that's 3,000 square feet instead of 2,700 square feet. Some of them where that number really does jump up is where I think then it becomes viable and kind of more attractive for people to actually put multiple homes on there. So just as you're kind of crunching through those numbers, I would think that where it's a marginal increase, that actually will have, in my view, negative effect, where it's just people who already have single-family homes building larger single-family homes rather than trying to get more homes in there. So that's all.
I wonder if the ADU conversation and changes that we've already have maybe make this easier, because there's already been a lot of panic about there's no single family housing zoning left in the city. I mean, that panic's already run through my neighborhood because of the ADU changes. So maybe some change to the R1 zones would be less controversial than it would have been 2 years ago, although probably still a lot. But I also like the idea of not tying it to something that you don't find everywhere, because I don't know that there are any alleys in my district. So if it's only possible to build more housing in places where there are alleys, they're not going to be where I live, which I don't think is a great idea, because I live in a nice neighborhood and more people should live there, should be able to have houses and live there.
I think one of the things that I'm most excited about with this is that it provides the option for full home ownership for a lot of the people that are of my generation and lower, to be able to have a piece of land that will accrue value. And I think that that's something that I would really love to kind of try to latch onto and move forward with if we can. Having the small lot that's fully owned versus, I'm not sure how the attached, allowing attached housing would work on some of these lots, but if it ends up being a triplex that is still rented, then that doesn't necessarily help the home ownership problem that all of our financial systems are attached to for people who can't currently own a home. So yeah, I could see there being a option with attached housing if there was some way to split ownership. And so I'm not saying attached housing is bad. I love the idea of attached housing, but just as we're prioritizing this and moving forward on this, really trying to action home ownership as an option, a viable option for people that cannot get that at this moment. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I will add, there's a very strong possibility that we're going to have a private entity submit a text amendment that would do a lot of these things. And so we're anticipating that actually coming rather soon. So we'll try to balance that out with this as well. And we have no idea how that's going to play out until we start going through that process. So, yeah.
One of the things about attached housing like townhouses is that I have come to understand that in actually in creating home ownership, it's actually easier to do townhouses than other kinds of multifamily, because it can be built as a separate.
Yep.
It's a separate thing. It can be rented or sold, and then you can move on to the next one. And so it doesn't require you to build an entire building and try to sell 60% of the units before you can even get financing on it. So it actually is an easier process for construction. So, my problem is that I think townhouses it's going to be really difficult in a lot of neighborhoods.
Yes.
A lot of neighborhoods. They are going to be a completely different design than your house. I mean that the houses next door. They're going to be something that's takes up more of the lot. They're going to be 2 stories and taller. They're just going to be.
Like, do you mean hard to design or hard for the neighbors to put up with?
Hard for the neighbors to put up with, not hard to design. Yeah,
But
hard for
they're
the
all-
neighbors to conceive of. I mean, I know that in my neighborhood in East Capitol Boulevard, they built townhouses, on a fairly large lot, and there was quite a bit of, in a neighborhood that was actually kind of diverse, but still the townhouses they were huge. I mean, they were not, small houses, but there's still a lot of pushback on something that's a different scale, different building type, different pattern. It has a lot of things that are very different, and people really prize, in general, the same. That's what that doesn't mean you couldn't do something that was kind of similar, frontage-wise, and still had some things in the back. So there's a lot of ways to slice that, but just sort of clearing a lot and building 3 townhouses where there used to be 1 house is going to be a tough sell.
Well, there are market concerns and investment and all that kind of stuff in addition to the zoning question, but maybe if there are more options, it's more likely to get more types of housing.
Yeah, the one thing we do know is if you don't allow the housing types, you're not going to get
Won't
them.
build it.
So, I mean, it's obvious, but, and I think there's a lot of reasons why we'd want to see more housing options in the city. I mean, the commission has already touched on some of that, being able to have something to purchase and build the wealth that comes with owning a home. But there's also some pretty significant issues too. I mean, related to our household sizes continually going down, which with that trend continuing in order to maintain school enrollment, that means we need more homes, and we'll need significantly more homes to
Our
offset
household
that.
size is going down, you're
Been
saying?
going
Our
down
family
for
size? Yeah,
decades.
okay.
Decades.
So at this point in time, can you take a 1,000 or 4,000 square foot home and divide it up into 3 or 4 units inside?
The only way that you can do that right now is through the affordable housing incentives in an R1.
Okay,
But
okay.
there's
But
an
would,
option.
would that be an option under this? Because that doesn't change the appearance of the home. It doesn't. It doesn't change the pattern of the houses on the street. It just allows a lot more people to live there than the 1 or 2 people that are living there now.
That is a potential solution as well.
The one option, the one problem, I mean, that's a great option, and I think that I'm crossing my fingers that people start using the affordable housing incentives because it's available. But I think that financing becomes maybe a little bit of an issue, but also it doesn't deal with the home ownership issue. So being able to take a 7,000 square foot lot and split it into 3 2,000 square foot lots, 2,000 and change lots, or 1,500 square foot lot and split it into 4, then now you have 4 separate people who are homeowners. And according to this chart where it was 300, the lots were selling for 380 instead of 600,000, then that's far more achievable than the insane rates that we have. So just being able to that ownership piece of being able to say well, we can have every lot somebody can choose to split it into 4 could be really great. So yeah.
Someone could sell their ADU If the lots are smaller, you'd split your lot?
Yeah, if they could create a lot to subdivide it off, then yes.
Is it easier to create new lots that are parcels, like you said with the legal definition, than in a subdivision? Or why did you mention that?
I mentioned that because if you're in an existing subdivision, the only way to create a new lot is go through a subdivision amendment. So there's built in, and that requires notice to neighbors when it's a subdivision amendment. So
Can the neighbors say no, or they just have?
they have, the only way that they can really say no to a subdivision amendment is if they are somehow materially, functionally harmed by it. So let me give you an example of what that means. Sometimes there may have been like a access easement that was agreed to by two property owners across a property after the plat was recorded. So it doesn't show up on the plat, but it shows up on the title and things like that. And sometimes those things are not fully provided to the city when somebody's going through. So if we notice a neighbor and like, hey, I have this recorded easement, it needs to be maintained, that would be an example of a situation where if we potentially subdivided without that, they would be materially harmed. So in situations like that, the solution is the subdivision has, the amendment would then add that kind of an easement to the amended plat. The only way to record a subdivision amendment is to record a plat for those new lots. So it's a technical process, but we do probably 50 or 60 subdivision amendments a year in our office, so. Well, we will. We'll keep you up to date on this as it progresses.
Thanks, everyone. We have run out of items on our agenda, and our next meeting will be September 11th. And at that meeting, we will also be choosing a new chair and vice chair. And see you in 2 weeks then.